There are places in England where time seems to gather like dust in the corners of an old room. Places where the past doesn't feel distant or abstract, but close enough to touch, close enough to breathe in. In the heart of central England, scattered across fields, villages, market towns, stand the old parish churches, somewhat grand and imposing, others half forgotten, yet each one is a witness. The witness to faith, to doubt, to community, to change. And in an increasingly secular society, their relevance is being questioned more than ever. But perhaps the better question is not whether these churches are still relevant, but what they reveal about who we were and who we are becoming. To understand their place in modern England, we need to step back, far back, before the spires, before the bells, before the carved angels and stained glass, before Christianity itself took root in these islands. Long before the first church foundations were laid, England was a patchwork of tribal kingdoms, each with its own gods, its own rituals, its own sacred places. The landscape was already holy. The rivers, the groves, the standing stones. Spirituality was almost woven into the land itself. And then, in the first century, the Romans arrived. They brought with them roads, baths, villas, and temples, all dedicated to Jupiter, Mars, Minerva. But Christianity? That would come later, quietly at first, like a rumour. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, Christianity had begun to spread among Roman soldiers, merchants, and administrators. It was still a minority faith, but it was growing. When the Roman Empire withdrew in the early 5th century, the fragile Christian communities that they left behind were just swept aside by waves of pagan Anglo Saxon settlers. And for a time, Christianity nearly vanished from what we now know as England. And then, in the year 597, a small group of monks landed on the shores of Kent. They were led by a Augustine, later known as Saint Augustine of Canterbury. They were sent by Pope Gregory the Great to convert the Anglo Saxons. It was a bold mission, and a dangerous one too, but it worked. Slowly, steadily, Christianity spread again, but this time taking deeper root. Kings converted, monasteries were founded, Christian churches built of timber and then stone, and by the 10th century, England was one of the most thoroughly Christian nations in Europe. The churches of central England, the ones we walk past today, are the descendants of that long, complex history. Many of them still stand on sites that have been sacred for over 1,000 years. Some still contain stones carved by Saxon hands. Others were rebuilt after the Norman conquest when William the Conqueror ordered a wave of church destruction that reshaped English landscape. The Normans built big, they built bold, and they built to last. Throughout the Middle Ages, the parish church was the centre of life in England, not just spiritually, but socially, politically, and even economically. It was where people gathered, where news was shared, where disputes were settled, and the keeper of records, the guardians of rites of passage, birth, marriage, death. The churchyard was the village's memory, just carved in stone. But history is never still, and the story of English Christianity is in the 16th century came the Reformation. That was a seismic shift that tore the country apart. Henry VIII broke from Rome, dissolved the monasteries, seized the wealth of the churches. The churches were stripped of their statues, relics, colourful paintings. Walls were whitewashed, altars were smashed, and the old medieval faith was replaced by a new Protestant identity. They're not without some resistance. Some churches still bear the scars of that upheaval: defaced carvings, broken noses on stone saints, empty niches where once stood the figures of devotion. Yet, even after the Reformation, the parish church remained central to English life. It adapted, it endured, it survived civil war, plague, industrialisation, and the rise of the cities. It survived the Victorian era when church attendance soared again and thousands of churches were restored, sometimes lovingly, sometimes aggressively in a wave of Gothic revival enthusiasm. But the 20th century brought a different kind of challenge, a quieter one, a more subtle one. The welfare state took over many of the roles that the church once played. Science offered new explanations for old mysteries, and by the late 20th century, church attendance had fallen sharply. Today, England is one of the most secular countries in Europe. Many churches stand half empty on Sundays. Some have closed, some have been converted into homes, cafes, community centres, or climbing walls for kids. Others remain open but struggle to maintain their ancient buildings. And yet, and this is the heart of the matter, the buildings themselves still speak. Walk into any old church in England and you'll feel it. The weight of centuries, the hush of stone, the sense that countless lives have passed through this space, each leaving a trace. You don't even have to be religious to feel it. You don't even have to believe in God. The building believes in it for you. It holds you gently in its long memory. These old churches are more than relics of a fading faith. They're archives of human experience. Just look at the architecture. The thick Norman pillars, round and solid, built to withstand time. The painted Gothic arches, reaching upward like prayers carved in stone. The medieval wall paintings, rediscovered under layers of plaster. The stained glass, glowing with stories. Saints, kings, angels, ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Each window is a sermon in colour. Look at the monuments, effigies of knights with crossed legs, brass plates engraved with family crests, tombs of merchants, mayors and vicars. These names once meant everything to their communities, now half forgotten, but still present, still part of the big story. Look at the pews, worn smooth by generations of hands, the baptismal font where countless children were welcomed into this world, the chancel steps where couples stood to promise their lives to each other, the bells that rang out for coronations, for victories, for peace and for mourning. In a society that is increasingly secular, increasingly mobile and increasingly digital, these churches offer something rare, a sense of rootedness, a reminder that we are all part of a story that began long before us and will continue long after we're gone. The question is not whether these buildings matter. They do, obviously. The question is, how do we choose to value them? Some argue that churches should be preserved purely as an historical monument like castles or stately homes. Others believe they should remain active places of worship, even if the congregations are small. Still, others see them as potential community hubs, flexible spaces for concerts, exhibitions, meetings, and social sports. Perhaps the answer is that they can be all of these things. We still need places where the noise of the world fades for a moment, places where we can just sit in silence and feel the weight of our own thoughts, places where we can connect, not just to each other, but with something larger than ourselves, whatever we choose to call that. Old churches offer that. They offer it freely without judgment, without expectation. But they also offer something else, and that's beauty. In an age of concrete boxes and glass towers, the craftsmanship of medieval builders feels almost miraculous. The precision of the stonework, The elegance of the tracery, the way the light moves through stained glass like water. These buildings were made by hand, by people who believed that beauty itself was a form of devotion. And perhaps most importantly, they become reminders of our shared humanity. Because when you stand in one of these old churches, whether in Bedfordshire, Northamptonshire, Warwickshire, or any other corner of England, you're standing in a place shaped by the countless hands and countless lives, where generations of villagers marked the milestones of their lives. You're standing in a space that's held joy and grief and hope and despair and faith and doubt. You're standing in a place that's seen everything. And that's why these buildings matter, not because they're old, though age gives them depth, sure, but because they're human, because they tell a story of our people, our landscape, and our culture. In an increasingly secular society, many people no longer share the beliefs that built these churches. But we can still honor that history. We can still find meaning in the silence, the stone, the light. Perhaps the relevance of these old church buildings can no longer be measured by the number of people in pews on Sunday mornings. Perhaps we can measure them by the way they continue to shape our sense of place in this world, by the way they anchor our communities, and by the way they remind us that we're all part of something much bigger. And as long as these buildings stand, they'll continue to speak, they'll continue to hold their stories, and they'll continue to offer a space where the past and present meet. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps in a world that is always rushing forward, we need places that hold us still. Perhaps that whisper of centuries, places that remind us that time is not something we're moving through, it's something we inherit. And these old churches of England are such places. They're not relics of a lost world, they are companions to a living one. They are part of the landscape and part of our shared memory, part of our identity. And whether we enter them to pray or to listen or to learn or simply breathe, they remain what they've always been, spaces of meaning.